everyone. This is Sofia Smallstorm on SpeedOfLight, which is a show on the Pure Momentum Network, a new network that I've joined. I'm very, very excited about it. And I want to introduce to you today my guest, Pete Hendrickson. Pete Hendrickson and I go back a few years at least. He is, in my opinion, and the opinion of many, many other people out there, the guy on income tax. Pete Hendrickson understands income tax better than anybody else in the country, and he's really a pioneer, a groundbreaker in this regard. So we will cover in this show, this first hour, what I call the false antithesis of income tax, which is trumpeted by many people out there telling you that it's unconstitutional, just don't file, ignore it, etc., etc. You'll learn today that income tax is actually constitutional. And with that, I will bring Pete in so that he can begin to talk to you himself. Are you there, Pete?
I am here, Sophia. I'm very pleased to be with you.
Well, thank you. I hope we'll enlighten people today. And there's a new YouTube channel, a Pure Momentum Network channel, and I hope that this show will be up on that and can be widely shared everywhere because people are so fond of YouTube now. So, Pete, I want to just mention, I developed with you the Independent Thinkers Income Tax Fact Sheet that can be bought. It's a postcard. I know that you have a supply of those, and I feature them on my website, avatarproducts.com. But the introduction to that little postcard, which has 10 facts about income tax on the front, it reads like this. Each year, millions of Americans report their earnings to the IRS, allowing a significant portion of their wealth to be claimed by the government. Yet the law itself stipulates that tax is only to be paid on a certain kind of income, a truth about which most Americans remain blissfully unaware. So let's hear it from you, Pete.
Okay. My first response, as much as I love that card that you produced, Sophia, it's wonderful. I include them a couple of copies of it with every book that goes out, every copy of Cracking the Code and my other titles. And I love those cards, but I will take issue since you've just read through it and the subject is on the table here with the blissfully ignorant part, because there's really nothing blissful about it. People are ignorant, indeed, although I don't try and say that in a belittling sense. They've been made ignorant by a state that has become very accustomed to corralling huge amounts of revenue, actually taking a part of every single economic transaction that takes place in this country. The state is living large on that pelf, and it is a great harm to the individuals to whom this is being done. So blissful in the sense of completely unknowing, and therefore not understanding how much they're being harmed and how much they should not be blissful about it at all. But the blissful thing kind of sets the wrong tone. It's an outrage. It is a near crime and certainly a scandal and very shameful. So, and I think that's a good path to start off on with regard to this subject. The fact is, the misunderstanding most Americans have about the tax is a thoroughly cultivated misunderstanding. The federal government in particular, but the state governments as well, for 75 years now and more, have inculcated in Americans' minds a complete fiction with regards to the lawful nature of the income tax in particular. And this is in concert with cultivating a misunderstanding of the constitutional relationship between citizen and state that exists in America, and that is the thing that makes America the exceptional place and event that it really is. A lot of people speak about American exceptionalism, but they have a not completely clear idea of why that's true. It is true because our structure is set up with a historically unique control mechanism installed on the state, and that mechanism is by way of the written Constitution. It is a body of law that binds the state down into very limited structures, very limited forms, very limited interface and impact with Americans. And it is only as long as those forms are respected and enforced that we can legitimately claim to be the exceptional place that we really should be. So,
well, let's start with the very basics, Pete, so that we can cover in this first hour those basics, and then another issue that is extremely important here, which is a trial that's coming up.
Sure.
So I know that you have explained, you have a book. Pete has a very, very wonderful book, Cracking the Code, and the subtitle is The Fascinating Truth About Income Tax in America. His website is losthorizons.com. So I urge people to definitely visit the website, see on it the record of the hundreds of refunds issued in their entirety. This is all the money withheld from people's quote-unquote wages. And I'll explain why we're using quotes around certain words. You will see with your own eyes that the way income tax is being applied in America by most of these people who are outrageously unaware. Let's use that word for Pete's sake. For Pete's sake, did you hear that?
I heard that.
Yes. Nobody is, or very few people have really cottoned to the truth about the income tax. And I want to start with that so that we get that clarified in this first hour.
Okay.
So, Pete, you had told me, and you tell many people over and over, that the income tax is an excise tax. It's not a direct tax. Could you explain that in simple terms?
Yeah, absolutely. The Constitution imposes two rules of taxation on the federal government. One is the rule regarding direct taxes. Any direct tax, capitation, or other direct tax has to be applied by the apportionment mechanism, which is the distribution of the tax amongst the national population, actually laid on the states themselves and distributed per their ratio of the national population. All other forms of tax that the federal government is allowed to impose must be indirect taxes, duties, tariffs, imposts, excises. Excises are pieces of the action tax. They are taxes that are laid on things that are done on a voluntary basis, and they are characterized in particular by the involvement of the use of a privilege of some sort extended by the taxing authority. As a consequence, the true nature of the income tax, which is in fact an excise tax, is summed up in the actual name of the tax. It is a federal income tax. It's a tax on federal income. It's not a federal tax on income. It's a tax on federal income. So if you simply say the title of the thing as you're accustomed to thinking of it, you will comprise, you will embrace the entirety of the nature of the tax. It is a federal income tax.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat that. It is not a federal tax on income, which means the feds don't have the right to grab some of what you earn every year. It is a tax on federal income, which means that which you earn from a federal source is taxable.
That's correct. And so really, the truth about the tax is actually nothing but a series of simple realities. That being one. Another simple reality, and this will strike a lot of people as very contrary to what they've been told their entire lives, what they've come to believe, and that is that our great-grandparents or grandparents, depending on how old you are, back in 1913, did not authorize the federal government to charge everyone a percentage of all of their economic activity. In other words, they didn't agree to become serfs themselves and their descendants back in 1913. We did not have a population of morons that year that decided that the magnificent structure that for 100 and at that point 30 years or so had made America the most prosperous country in the history of the world was no longer any good, and they were going to throw out that structure and replace it with one in which the federal government had access to everyone's wealth and everyone's earnings. That whole idea is absolutely absurd, and yet it's one that most Americans have been taught to, or conditioned really, to believe to be true. It was not. The 16th Amendment was a very, very simple loophole closing act. It overruled a Supreme Court ruling of 1895 that had excused two particular types of income earnings, and that is earnings that actually qualified as federal income, from being touched by the tax on the basis of an argument that earnings that are connected with a private property source, in this case stock dividends and rent on real estate, a tax on those earnings constituted a property tax rather than an actual income tax. And the court in the 1895 ruling, Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust, concluded that in those two cases, in regard to those two things, the income tax was actually a property tax and actually had to be apportioned. As a result, in 1913, an amendment was adopted to the Constitution that specified that resort to the source argument would not be viable, and essentially overruled that single Supreme Court ruling and the single loophole that it had opened up in the application of the tax.
So in 1913, most people have this fallacious notion that the income tax was instituted in 1913 when it was really instituted, I think, in 1862, right?
That's correct. Actually, it originally was enacted in 1861, but that 1861 Act was repealed and replaced in its entirety the next year with the 1862 Act, which remains the current law today.
So in 1913, when we got this 16th Amendment, most people think that's when the income tax was expanded or broadened, but it wasn't. You're telling us it closed a loophole, and there was a court case. What was it, Pollock Farmers something?
Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust.
Okay.
In 1895, this was an occasion in which someone who had been, there was a revival of the tax at that point. The tax had been dormant for about 20 years in 1894, and Congress had decided to revive it. And when that revival took place, a stockholder in Farmers Loan and Trust, which was an organization that had a lot of investments in national railroads, among other things, proposed to pay the tax before distributing dividends. And Charles Pollock objected to this and sued the company to prevent them from paying the tax prior to the distribution of dividends. And the case went to the Supreme Court, and the court applied the reasoning that I described earlier. It reasoned that because Pollock owned personally the stock from which the dividends were to proceed, that the tax on the dividends, which was legitimately income, quote unquote, federal income, because it was based in national railroads, was in that case actually a property tax on his stock. And because a property tax does indeed have to be apportioned, it being a direct tax, the court concluded that in that particular case, in that particular application, the tax failed constitutionally.
Okay, so why has it been lionized, this whole 1913 thing?
Well, the fact is a lot of people really like the state to be this enormous Leviathan thing that controls everyone's lives, that distributes a lot of wealth around. But of course, the people who do the controlling and the distributing, of course, like it a great deal. They pay themselves handsomely out of the take, and are graced with a great deal of power as a consequence of this. They're having their hands on all of this wealth. People who receive the distribution and are net gainers, of course, like this arrangement. And collectivists in general like this arrangement because they like the central state having the kind of power that controlling the distribution of wealth provides. So there are interests that view themselves as benefiting from this structure. And those interests have been, were in the ascendancy somewhat in the 1930s and 1940s in particular, and succeeded in mutating what prior to that time, prior to those decades, had been a consistently clear understanding of the tax into a misunderstanding. And we saw, in fact, a remarkable transformation in the early 1940s from the previous, all the years in which the income tax had been operating since 1862. The average percentage of earners that filed tax returns during all those years was 8.9%, a small fraction of the total earning population. By 1943, it was 93%.
Right, and now the reason that there was an 8% of the population that paid tax was because they were involved in activities which gave them taxable income, right?
Sure. Yeah,
and that's what we want to explain to our listeners, that there is a taxable income, and it is the consequence of something that results from the exercise of federal privilege, the involvement of federal control or ownership, right? Am I saying it right?
Yeah, anything that involves the gainful exercise of a federal privilege, prerogative, or property qualifies as income, quote unquote. I'm going to put scare quotes around that because when we're talking about income in the context of the tax, we're talking about federal income.
Right.
And now, there is a large amount of that. I mean, think about the size of the federal government. It throws a lot of money around, and the people who are earning that are involved in exercising federal privileges. The people who are getting paid that, in many cases, are benefiting from access to a federal privilege. And so there are a substantial number of Americans who actually earn more than the exemption amount of federal income, thus necessitating the filing of a tax return. However, that substantial number is dwarfed by the much, much, much larger number of Americans who don't have income at all, or have the amount they have is below the exemption amount, and therefore are not required to file returns.
Okay, and here I'm going to clarify that we operate with the misconception that anything we earn is called income. That word is thrown around, and in fact, it's a legal word. It has a specific definition, which is money that results from the exercise of federal privilege. So private sector earnings, and that's what most people in America get. They are paid by people in the private sector, not the federal government. So their earnings are not income.
Yeah, that's correct. Unfortunately, because of that kind of massive, successful generation of misunderstanding that took place during the 30s and 40s, beginning in the 1940s, and the thing that led to that 93% filing rate all of a sudden is a practice of the government to distribute forms and to encourage payers to fill these forms out and report payments made to each other. And in doing so, they're reporting these payments as being federally connected, even though the people who are filling the forms out have no idea that that's what they're actually saying. They just simply, in that moment, after the Great Depression, in the midst of World War II, subject to exhortations from Donald Duck, of all people, Walt Disney was hired to propagandize this misinformation during the early 1940s. All these things came together, and along with a very concerted disinformation campaign on the part of progressive intellectuals that have been going on pretty much since the adoption of the 16th Amendment. That began in the actually, even before the amendment was adopted, there was a drumbeat of disinformation coming from progressive interests who were very much in favor of the misunderstanding that we suffer from today. All those things came together in the 1940s. The government took a shot at sending these what are called information return forms out to businesses across the country. And these businesses, getting these forms, which have on them custom legal terms, but with the definitions of those legal terms left, omitted from the forms themselves. Custom legal terms such as wages, employee, employer, trade or business, and others, made to look like common words, certainly taken to mean common words by the people who received these forms, but not actually having their common meanings at all, encouraged these people to report payments made to others on these forms and to send copies of the forms to the federal government. What's actually being said by these forms is that the payments were federally connected, even though in most cases they were not. Okay. And once this happened, the feds began exploiting this avalanche of affidavits to begin harassing people for taxes. And that the transformation of understanding had happened to such a great degree that virtually overnight, in the course of an 18-month period of time, we went from that 8.9% to that 93%. And for the most part, the feds have never looked back. They're happy as bugs in a rug. And the American people have since then been seeing about probably on average 45% or so of their wealth taken from them and off to state houses in Washington and being, in many cases, used against their interests from that point forward. And that's where we're at today.
Right. So what you're really saying is that most of what people earn today, most people earn what I call not income. They do not earn income. Income is a legal word. They have earnings. They're paid money for services or goods, but it is not income. And this is why I put up the website. It's more or less a mini website, notincome.com.
Sure.
If you go to notincome.com, that gives you a brief overview of Pete's material, which you can track down to its most nitty-gritty bits and pieces. LostHorizons.com is Pete's website. So,
and on Lost Horizons, by the way, forgive me interrupting, Sophia, but just to follow your point, I think on LostHorizons.com, you will see, as Sophia mentioned earlier, the consequences of actually learning what we're talking about right now, learning the truth about the tax, which has never changed, which is in fact immutable. It's incapable of being changed, and which allows individuals to whom the tax has been improperly applied to get all their money back. Because in fact, if in fact one has not actually engaged in taxable activities, one doesn't owe the tax. One never did owe the tax. And knowing whether this is true or not, and how to invoke the law on one's behalf, enables one to get all of the amounts paid in or collected as tax back, which is a really wonderful thing.
Right. It is a wonderful thing, Pete, and it has worked for thousands and thousands of people. Most likely, you are showing on your website the actual filings with the names blacked out. I think, are the names blacked out? Maybe the addresses are blacked out.
Oh, it's, some folks like to maintain a little anonymity. Others do not. Not every check or transcript or notice of deficiency closing notice or whatever that I have posted includes all of the filed documents that produced it, but many do. It really has been quite gratifying that as people learn this exciting and very liberating truth, many of them stand up foursquare and face to the sun and proudly announce their activism on behalf of the rule of law, which is all that is involved here. That's what we're doing, is we're enforcing the Constitution, and we're doing it proudly. And many of these folks are just gratifyingly generous in sharing their information and in doing so, in the full daylight.
So I want to just go back. We have a few minutes until our first network break, and I want to summarize that Pete mentioned an information return protocol that was begun in the 1940s. This was, as Pete put it, a shot that the government took at really brainwashing people. It trained bookkeepers and accountants in the art of creating these information returns for quote-unquote employers. Now, these would be the 1099s, the W-2s that people get every year, and we are required to send a copy of that information return to staple it to our tax filing.
Well, we're required if we actually believe that what it says is true.
Right, but most people do believe that, Pete.
Most people do believe it.
Yes. So Pete's website and his book will enlighten you as to why these reports are actually, they in fact criminalize the people who are filling them out. I learned from you, Pete, that there's only one employer in the country, and it is the federal government. Everybody else is not an employer. Employer is a word that has very specific legal meaning. So does employee. And yet people throw this around. They go, oh yeah, I'm an employee of such and such company, or
Sure.
so-and-so, my boss is my employer. Right. And the whole, there's more trickery applied to other words: wages, income, employer, employee, U.S. trade, legal words. And yet, when they're used in colloquial language, they're accepted. And it's on the basis of this acceptance that people are willing to forfeit this large portion of their earnings every year, believing that this is, mandatory tax that they have to pay. Yeah,
I've never been completely settled in my mind about how much this is a scheme and how much it is not. Certainly, if someone were to design a scheme intending to get this result, they could think of nothing cleverer than to use homonyms of common words for their legal terms in the fashion in which it is done in the tax law. On the other hand, though, we have to remember that context is everything in law. And when the government makes reference to employees, the context dictates that it's speaking of its own employees. If you were to receive in your mailbox one day a notice on Sears letterhead that said all employees are to report to a 9 o'clock meeting Monday morning, and you worked for pennies, would you imagine that notice applied to you just because it said employee? You would not. You'd know perfectly well that it doesn't, because it's a Sears form, and obviously it only applies to Sears employees or Sears workers. In this case, it's the same thing. This is a federal form talking about employees. Why would anybody imagine that it's talking about somebody else's employees?
Right. But these employers, quote unquote, all over the country, their accountants and bookkeepers say, hey, you have to send out 1099s every year for your contracted help, and you have to do wage withholdings. In 1942, the government instituted a wage withholding program and taught what they were doing. I learned from you, and I'd like you to tell us when we get to the other side of the break about the Senate subcommittee hearing in 1942 and what the concept of creating internal revenue really was for, the war effort, and how it was established that if the government borrowed your money through wage withholding for a year, then you had the chance of getting it back by filing your tax return that would assert by your own testimony, by way of your own testimony, that you were not someone who had earned income, and that you had allowed the federal government to have your money for a year in the form of these withholdings from your wages, supposedly, but now you want all of that back. That's what the individual tax return is for.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Well, a return is for three different things, really. It's a form for reporting and acknowledging income receipts above the exemption amount, or including and going above the exemption amount. Again, income with the scare quotes around it. We're talking about federal income here. It's for that purpose. It's for the purpose of rebutting allegations of having received federal income in those amounts. And it's for reclaiming amounts that had been withheld or paid in or otherwise collected, which actually don't prove to be owed. So it has several uses, and certainly the recovery one is a very important use.
Okay, well, it is time for our network break now, and we'll get back on the other side, and I'll have Pete go over this one more time so it's perfectly clear. You're listening to Sofia Smallstorm on the Speed of Light show. This is the Pure Momentum Network, and we will be right back with my incredible guest, and he really is, Pete Hendrickson.
Hello, my name is Ingrid Castle. I host Immunize Wisely here on Pure Momentum Network. You are invited to join me and my guest as we discuss relatively unknown vaccine history, science, and related issues. Immunize Wisely will arm you with the information you need to make common sense decisions concerning your health. Join me as we discover together what creates disease and how to achieve optimal wellness. Again, Ingrid Castle on Immunize Wisely.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Deborah Taveras of StopTheCrime.net, and I welcome you to Stop the Crime on the Pure Momentum Network. I am committed to exposing the ongoing war being waged not only against all American people, but the entire global population by international central banking cabals and their minions. We will be talking to you about the silent weaponized systems of assaults upon the population, which will help to define what everybody knows: something is terribly wrong. The corporate banking system has created the illusion that we have a legitimate government, and we do not. This corporate structure has gradually taken control of our country's economy, legal system, intelligence, military, scientific, and political operations. Only by understanding your reality will you be able to engage in solutions, and there are solutions. And we must engage. We must help others. We must live in right conduct and not be afraid. Visit us on the Pure Momentum Network and StopTheCrime.net.
Welcome back, everyone, to Speed of Light on Pure Momentum Network with Pete Hendrickson, my guest. This is Sofia Smallstorm. Okay, Pete, so can you go over the purpose of the 1040 individual income tax return? You said it's for reporting income amounts in excess of the exemption that they give you every year.
Yeah, anyone who has received more than the exemption amount of income, quote unquote income, federal income, is obliged by the terms of the agreement by under which one uses federal privilege to enjoy gains to file a return accurately reporting that amount of income. So that's one of the uses of the form. Another use of the form is to rebut assertions by others to the effect that that requirement has been invoked. In other words, if other folks say that someone has had more than the exemption amount of income and would therefore be required to file a return, but it isn't true, the form is used to rebut that assertion. And then the third primary use of the form is to reclaim amounts withheld or paid in or otherwise collected, which don't actually or didn't actually prove to be owed. And
this is the basis for that wage withholding program that they initiated in the early 40s, where the government...
Whether it was the basis or not, maybe too strong of a statement, Sophia. It was in the procedure for reclaiming withheld amounts was upgraded in conjunction with the Current Tax Withholding Act of 1943, which reinstituted withholding against wages. And it was certainly done in recognition of the fact that a great deal of improper withholding would take place. So you're correct, absolutely, in that sense. The withholding on the pay made to the federal workforce had been relaxed in 1916. It had been a feature of the tax from 1862 forward, but in 1916 it was allowed to lapse, and wasn't resumed until the act in 1943. And at that time, additional provisions were made to account for the fact that many folks would be having withholding take place improperly, and allowing for the means for recovering that improperly withheld money.
Okay, so I'm going to read point number 6 on that little fact sheet. I'm using this as a guide so that I can keep it simple. Each year, millions of W-2 and 1099 reports are issued for quote unquote wages or quote unquote non-employee compensation by payers who do not understand that these forms are intended for federal entities making federally connected payments. So these W-2s and 1099s, these are federal forms for federal use, everybody. W-2 and 1099 forms serve as legal testimony and without rebuttal make the named individuals liable for an income tax. And that income is in quotes. So these forms are used on us, and we don't know that they immediately set us up for the obligation to pay tax on what we earned. Because those numbers, our earnings are reported on those forms from those people who are most likely not federally connected and using the forms intended for federal payers. Right?
That's absolutely true. Although we ought to know that this is what's going on, because everyone will reflect on the fact, or should reflect on the fact, that they get a copy of these forms when they're created and produced. And there's only one reason for that. It isn't in order to ensure that an individual is able to accurately write down the numbers on a 1040. Everybody is supposed to keep their own records and be able to do that on their own. These forms are sent in order to put an individual on notice that an allegation is being made, a legal allegation is being made about them. That's the reason, and that's the purpose that copy that goes to the reportee is all about.
Right, and again, it's so normalized, Pete. I'm realizing as I do other interviews on other subjects that we have come to normalize so much that has nothing to do with us, and that is not that which we should tolerate. But here we are, when we go to work for someone, they make you fill out that W-4 form, right? On which you put your Social Security number.
Yeah, happily, those forms actually function as prospective forms. They don't have the magic power to convert something that isn't actually federal activity into federal activity. And you signing a form like that and putting a Social Security number down on it and so forth does not make it happen any more than you signing a form declaring yourself to be the Queen of Sheba actually makes you the Queen of Sheba. These things, that's not how it works. It does provide that if you should prove to be engaged in a federal activity, withholding will take place in certain ways. I mean, you have expressed your preferences for how withholding would take place under those circumstances. But happily, the completion of that form doesn't create those circumstances or make into those circumstances what really aren't.
Okay, so
nonetheless, it does serve to reinforce this paradigm that you were referring to, and that's very critical. Everyone has come to imagine themselves to live within a reality, to live within a federal universe, and to imagine that everything that they do is something quite different than what it really is in most cases.
Yeah, so you fill out this form, and the quote-unquote employer, who's not a federal employer, has your Social Security number and immediately believes that they need to withhold wages and send them over to the IRS on your behalf, and then they send you a W-2 form at the end of the year in the right time frame, and most people agree and accept what's on those forms, and then they think that the little bit of deduction and stuff that they get on their tax return, that this is the equivalent of enormous generosity on the part of the government, right?
Yeah, they throw a party and they have a refund party because they got back 1/40th of the amount that was withheld from them, and the rest of which was kept and spent on bureaucrats supervising every waking moment and an awful lot of sleeping moments of their lives. It's a pretty sorry spectacle when you think about it.
So the 1040 U.S. individual income tax return, this form is provided to us as a way for us to correct information testimony made about us by other people.
That's one of its key purposes. Absolutely, it is the only way to make those corrections. Let's get to that. That's an important thing to point out. Silence does not make those corrections. In fact, silence actually constitutes acquiescence, agreement with the allegations that have gone unanswered. So that's not an option. You can't write letters to the government or the tax agencies and have them have any meaning, because they don't. There is a specific form that is necessary, that has the components that are necessary to actually answer these allegations and to actually register one's position on these matters, and that is the 1040.
Yeah, the 1040 is your chance to correct the record that has been what's been reported about you, and not filing a return waives your right to correct that record, right? Silence, it doesn't help you at all if you are the recipient of this reported testimony.
Any more than it does if someone has accused you of breaking and entering or parking illegally or whatever. Would anyone resort to silence in the case of an accusation like that or an assertion? Of course not. And the same thing is true here. Non-filing is absolutely the craziest thing that someone could do if they disagree with what is being with the assertion or allegation that they did something taxable. It's absolutely crazy.
Well, now, Pete, what gives the IRS the right to file a return for you, which they frequently seem to do or try to do?
They actually very, 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 very rarely do it. It's as rare as hen's teeth.
Is it?
Absolutely. It's remarkably rare. In fact, I don't know that I've ever actually seen an actual IRS filed substitute return that meets the statutory provisions associated with that authority. They do have the authority to do it. In certain instances, it's a somewhat limited authority, and actually doesn't extend to 1040s, but they do in some cases have that authority. But it's very rare because it's necessary for whoever is doing it to actually swear under penalties of perjury to the truth of what they're asserting on that form, just as it is for you or anyone else. And it is a rare thing indeed for an official, an IRS bureaucrat, to be willing to make that kind of assertion under penalty of perjury.
Well, I know they threaten to do it quite often. I've heard people tell me, "Oh, they're going to do it for me," they said.
They threaten to do it a fair bit, just as this is the junkyard dog of the governmental structure. It lives on bluff. It lives on threats. It lives on scare, and it engages in those things at all times.
All right. Now, Pete, I want you to explain, before we get into the issue of the trial, because I want to cover that also in the first hour. I'd like you to explain this whole idea of philosophy, your belief playing such a big part in this income tax machine. And I know that this is something you discovered in your own experience, right?
Clarify for me, Sophia. My belief, my personal belief, or the impact of belief generally as a component of the tax.
Well,
of the application of the tax.
You are required.
Belief is very critical.
Yes, I know. This is what I'm trying to get you into a discussion of. So we are required to sign our tax returns. We are required to swear under oath to all these things, and this constitutes it's an expression, according to them, of our belief. If you refuse to sign it, an unsigned tax return is useless.
Yes, absolutely. It's useless and is deemed legally a nullity. Yes, the jurat or perjury statement, the affirmation on a tax return, specifically invokes one's belief. It is to the best of my knowledge and belief, what's reported on the form is true, complete, and correct, or words to that effect. point is, one, that it is in fact an affidavit, that a 1040, a tax return of all tax forms, constitute testimonial documents. They are affidavits. They're declaring what the signer believes to be true. And this is a critical point, because it's a critical point in the misapplication of the tax, because it explains why there is a concerted effort to convince people to believe a myth about the nature of the tax and the nature of income. When they do believe it, then they sign those forms deliberately, imagining that what they're saying is true when they report all of their earnings, everything that they received, as being something reportable under the tax laws and upon which the tax can be laid. That's purely, in most cases, that is purely a matter of belief. It's just a myth. It isn't true, but they believe it. Obviously, if the tax were being applied in every case on a purely objective basis, in other words, only when there actually had been a taxable activity engaged in, what the filer believed would have nothing whatsoever to do with it, any more than your property tax bill is connected with belief. You don't get, you're not expected to sign a perjury affirmation declaration with regard to your property taxes, are you? You just get a bill, right?
Right.
There's the difference, and the fact is the tax system definitely exploits the mythology that has been cultivated in most Americans' minds and gets them to say that they believe their earnings qualified for the tax. And once they have said so, once you have an allegation made on a W-2 or a 1099, and you have a filer who's agreeing with it, who's saying they believe it's true, that's the end of the legal contest. There isn't anything else to be discussed at that point. It's just a matter of where do we send the bill or how do we collect the money.
Right. So you have until April 15th to attest to whether that report made about you is true or untrue.
That's correct. Well, April 15th or whatever.
Extension, right. Most people hear of April 15th.
Yes.
Okay, so this idea of, when an IRS agent gets on your tail and starts threatening you and making calls and telling you what's what, I want to get into the notion of witness tampering. I know that that's an active topic on your website.
It is, yes, and it is a topic well worth getting into right now, and for a very simple reason. And to give a little backstory, ever since Cracking the Code was published in 2003, the first printing, the IRS has been actively trying to suppress the book, discourage people from reading it, and discourage people from acting on what they read in the book. That effort has been relentless. It has been subtle and not so subtle. It has been unsuccessful. It's been dramatically unsuccessful, so dramatically unsuccessful that at this point, tens of thousands of Americans routinely reclaim all of the money withheld from them and have been doing so for a little better than 10 years now. Because it has been unsuccessful, these efforts have been unsuccessful, and because the government's interest in success in this regard is so high, some of the efforts to suppress have been quite dramatic. And in 2006, 4 days before tax day, on April 12th in 2006, my wife and I were served with papers on a lawsuit that the government had brought in which it was asking a court to order us to repudiate two filings that we had made, one for 2002 and one for 2003, and to replace them with tax returns containing testimony dictated to us by the government. The idea was to give the government a pretext for reversing two complete refunds that had been made to us, and to be able to announce to the world that Pete Hendrickson had declared his earnings to qualify for the tax. The hope was that the ever-increasing tide of CTC, Cracking the Code, educated Americans would recede at that point. Of course, we didn't do this, but this was the object of this exercise. And the court, rather to our surprise, without so much as even a hearing of any kind, granted this request by the government and issued issued orders to my wife and me that we do these things. Not only that we replace our freely filed tax returns and the testimony we had freely made on those returns with government dictated words and swear to them as being our own words. That was part of the requirement. One that later was modified to require us to conceal the fact that we had been ordered to create these false documents. Also, it prohibited us from filing returns containing certain very explicit or based on very explicit notions, which were ascribed to cracking the code, even though they don't actually aren't actually found in cracking the code. And in fact, are specifically rebutted in cracking the code. But it gave their notions that allowed the court to describe them as frivolous, because they actually are frivolous. The things that we're prohibited from basing a filing on. This was in 2006.
So in 2003 and 2002, you and your wife filed what the first educated returns that you know of. I call them educated returns.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good name for them, and I call them that too. And that's exactly correct. They were the very first. The 2002 was the very first anyway. Other people did it in before our 2003 filings were made, because by that time some copies of CTC were out in circulation. But yeah, we did that. We received those first complete refunds
of all withholdings.
Everything, Social Security, Medicare, everything. First in history, and by 2006, many thousands of Americans were doing exactly the same thing and getting all their money back as well. The government had engaged in initially in four failed efforts to suppress the book. In 2006, it took a step further down the dark path and brought this lawsuit asking a court to issue these illegal orders, obviously unconstitutional First Amendment violating orders, dictating testimony to us, dictating words, trying to force words into our mouths.
To get you to file other amended returns that would give them they were asking for their money back that they had given to you, right?
Well, that's correct, but but since they had no basis for reclaiming it, they demanded that we be made to declare our earnings to have been from taxable activities, and therefore they would then be able to say that therefore we owed a tax.
Right.
So it was a lift yourself up by your own bootstraps kind of affair from that standpoint. More significantly, to my mind, in the broader scheme of things, was the degree of First Amendment violation that's involved there, and the Fifth Amendment violation. If you think about the idea of someone being commanded to facilitate their adversary's claim in a legal contest, which is what this is about. If we could be made to agree with our adversaries, with the government's allegation that what we had done was taxable, where does that stop? Why bother holding trials any longer, civil or any other kind, if the government can make their target testify, per its instructions? What's the point of any kind of legal affair in the future at all? This is patently absurd. But these are the orders that got made, and in 2013, 7 years later, 6 years after the orders were issued, my wife was suddenly arrested on a charge of contempt of court for not having done what these orders dictated, and went to trial in October of last year. Astonishingly, but actually in complete concert with the whole package here, prior to trial, the government asked the trial court to instruct the jury that the unconstitutionality and unlawfulness of the orders made to us, in which Doreen was being charged with resisting, was not to be considered by the jury. Now think about that.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
It's astonishing. Another first, another American historical first.
The government says it doesn't matter what we're asking, that what we're asking is unconstitutional, criminal, et cetera, et cetera. Just forget about all that. We need this testimony from her, and we're going to get it.
Yeah. So happily, the jury didn't buy it, and even in spite of this instruction, which was given, refused to convict Doreen. Unfortunately, they didn't take it all the way and also acquit, but the trial ended in a hung jury, and the government, recognizing that the information in cracking the code is absolutely fatal to the continued maintenance of the Leviathan state that the operators of government love so much, are bringing the charge again and intend to retry Doreen in July, this coming July. So we don't know whether or not that egregiously unconstitutional order or instruction to the jury will again be sought and given, but certainly the very fact that this is persisting is an expression of intense corruption and also an expression of how important this issue is, the issue of this knowledge is to the state, which I hope most people listening here will recognize means that it's that important to you too.
Yeah. Now, you had said in a previous interview that I heard that the government has asked the court, or in this last trial, asked the court to make Doreen declare her agreement that her earnings do qualify for the tax, and that would release the government from having to prove that those earnings qualified for the tax, because
Sure.
the government has to prove it. But if she says so and she swears, this is where the belief thing becomes so pertinent and strong. If she says it and agrees with it and swears, then they don't have to prove.
That's exactly correct.
Yeah. So, and again, what we have to remember here is that the government is forcing a litigant in a legal contest to agree with its version of the facts.
Yeah, it's astonishing, isn't it?
Yes.
Again, as I said a few minutes ago, if that prevails, if that is allowed to stand, and so far, the media are taking no interest in this case, and the courts have been on the wrong side of this thus far. If that stands, it's the end of the judicial system. It's the end of any kind of legitimate judicial process in this country. It is impossible for a litigant to prevail if they are required to adopt their adversaries' fact positions. It's just that simple. I mean, this needs no explanation. This is sufficient for a fifth grade education, I think. And I don't know what else to say about it. It's just remarkable.
Yeah, and Pete, the $64,000 question is: do the sheeple people care? Is anybody going to bat an eye that this is going through the court?
Well, it would be my hope, I think, that our conversation about it right now will, go some ways toward awakening people to this issue and prompt them to take an interest and raise their eyes and then raise their voices.
Now, Pete, may I read a couple of paragraphs from Doreen's opening statement from the last trial?
Oh, please do.
Here goes. This is Doreen Hendrickson's opening statement, her October 2013 trial. I am accused by the government of having committed a crime for refusing to obey an order to swear to facts I do not believe are true. I agreed to obey the order if I could also simply add to my signature that I had been ordered by a judge to swear to the facts. That didn't suit the government, however. Not only must I obey an order to swear to something I do not believe, but I am not allowed to indicate that I've been ordered to swear under threat of imprisonment. So this, to me, is pretty amazing.
It is indeed, and again, I hope that everyone hearing these words finds it equally amazing and disturbing.
Now, another paragraph. The judge, without ever having laid eyes on me, without reviewing any evidence, and without holding any hearing at all, signed a ruling that was written by a government attorney. The court ordered me to say what the government attorney wanted me to say. The court ordered me to swear to it under penalty of perjury. I was to put these dictated words on a legal document that was part of a civil case in which the government was a party and by which the government would benefit. And I'm going to skip a little bit and conclude with, as best I have been able to discover, no American court has ever made an order like this before, nor has anyone ever before been subjected to criminal charges for refusing to swear to testimony dictated by the government.
Yep, that's absolutely true. That has never, ever, ever happened before in American history. And again, I want to emphasize for people hearing these words, the degree to which that fact underscores how important what the information revealed in cracking the code is to an American citizen. It is critically important. It is astonishingly important. It is so important that the government will go to any lengths to stop you from seeing it. The only thing that they've shied away from is assassinating me or outright banning my books, and I think that's only because that would draw too much attention to these things.
Situation. All right. Well, we are at the end of our first hour. Thank you so much, Pete Hendrickson, for your amazing contribution to American life. Pete's website is losthorizons.com. My little mini website that does an overview for this information is notincome.com. So anyway, thank you so much, Pete, for being with us, and many thanks to our first hour listeners. This is Sofia Smallstorm. I invite you to join us for the second hour in the members section, where you're going to hear a lot more from Pete. All of this is crucial to your life today.
We invite all our listeners to join us in the members section for the second hour of all our shows. We encourage you to click on the subscribe button, choose a membership type, pay with PayPal, and voila, you're a member. Enjoy all Pure Momentum Network material, the second hour of all talk shows, extra interviews,